The year was 1945. The world stood at a crossroads, emerging from the shadows of a devastating conflict that had reshaped nations and altered the course of history. World War II, a conflict of unprecedented devastation, had finally come to an end. The war had left cities in ruins, economies shattered, and millions of lives lost. Soldiers returned home, carrying with them the scars of battle and the hope for a peaceful future. As the smoke cleared, a new world order began to emerge. Nations embarked on the arduous task of rebuilding, seeking to restore what had been lost and to create a better world for future generations. World leaders convened, determined to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. But instead of peace, a different kind of struggle was taking shape, one that would define the latter half of the 20th century, the Cold War. This was not a war of guns and tanks, but of ideologies and influence, a battle for the hearts and minds of people across the globe. The Cold War was not a traditional war with armies clashing on battlefields. It was a global rivalry between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Each sought to expand its influence and promote its vision of governance and society. It was a time of intense political and military tension. The United States championed democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union promoted communism and a centrally planned economy. These two nations, recent allies against Nazi Germany, found themselves on opposite sides of a deep ideological divide. These two nations, recent allies against Nazi Germany, found themselves on opposite sides of a deep ideological divide. The camaraderie of wartime cooperation quickly gave way to suspicion and rivalry, as each side sought to assert its dominance in the post-war world. Their struggle for dominance played out not through direct military confrontation, but through proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, and an arms race of terrifying proportions. From the Korean Peninsula to the jungles of Vietnam, from the deserts of the Middle East to the streets of Berlin, the Cold War's reach was global. The Cold War cast a long shadow over the world. It influenced the policies of nations far beyond the borders of the United States and the Soviet Union, shaping alliances and enmities that persist to this day. The ideological battle between East and West permeated every aspect of life, from politics to culture. It shaped international relations, influenced domestic politics, and left an indelible mark on the lives of millions. The fear of nuclear annihilation loomed large, affecting the psyche of entire generations. Everyday life was colored by the tension of the era, from civil defense drills to the space race. Understanding this complex period is essential to grasping the dynamics of the modern world. The Cold War's legacy is evident in today's geopolitical landscape, in the continued existence of NATO and the United Nations, and in the ongoing struggles for power and influence. In this essay, we will delve into the origins, key events, and lasting impact of the Cold War. We will explore how this period of intense rivalry and competition shaped the world we live in today, and how its echoes continue to influence global affairs. The roots of the Cold War can be traced back to the closing days of World War II. As the world celebrated the end of a devastating conflict, new tensions began to emerge on the horizon. The Allied powers, who had fought together to defeat the Axis, now found themselves at odds over the future of the world order. As the Allied powers met to discuss the post-war order, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union began to surface. The Potsdam Conference in 1945, attended by leaders such as Stalin, Truman, and Churchill, highlighted these growing rifts. While the leaders discussed the reconstruction of Europe and the fate of Germany, underlying ideological differences became increasingly apparent. These two nations, while united in their fight against fascism, had vastly different visions for the future. The wartime cooperation between US and Soviet soldiers was a temporary alliance born out of necessity. As the common enemy was defeated, the ideological chasm between capitalism and communism began to widen.
The United States, a capitalist democracy, sought to promote free markets and democratic values around the world. American leaders believed that economic freedom and political democracy were the keys to peace and prosperity. The post-war American economy boomed, and the US aimed to extend this model globally, hoping to create a world where democracy and capitalism could flourish. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, aimed to expand its sphere of influence and spread communist ideology. Stalin envisioned a world where communism would prevail, providing an alternative to the capitalist system. The Soviet Union, having suffered immense losses during the war, was determined to rebuild and secure its borders against any future threats. Stalin, deeply suspicious of the West, sought to create a buffer zone of friendly states in Eastern Europe. This buffer zone was intended to protect the Soviet Union from future invasions and to ensure that neighboring countries would not pose a threat. The Soviet influence in Eastern Europe grew as communist governments were established in countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. He believed this would protect the Soviet Union from future invasions. The Soviet military parades and border defenses were a clear indication of Stalin's determination to safeguard his nation. The Soviet Union's preparations for potential conflicts were extensive, reflecting the deep-seated fears and suspicions that characterized the era.
Adding to the tension was the issue of atomic weapons. The development and use of atomic bombs introduced a new and terrifying element to international relations. The sheer destructive power of these weapons changed the nature of warfare and diplomacy forever. The US's use of atomic bombs against Japan in 1945, while ending the war, also raised alarm bells in Moscow. The devastation witnessed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki served as a stark reminder of the potential for destruction. The Soviet Union, aware of the strategic advantage the US now held, felt an urgent need to catch up. The Soviet Union, determined to achieve parity, embarked on its own atomic program, further fueling mistrust and suspicion between the two superpowers. Soviet scientists worked tirelessly to develop their own atomic capabilities, leading to a nuclear arms race that would define much of the Cold War era. The seeds of rivalry were sown, and the Cold War began to take root. Propaganda from both sides depicted the other as the enemy, and the world was soon divided into two opposing camps. The early years of the Cold War were marked by a series of confrontations and crises, each bringing the world closer to the brink of nuclear conflict. The post-war tensions had set the stage for a prolonged and perilous struggle for global supremacy. At the heart of the Cold War lay a fundamental clash of ideologies: capitalism versus communism. This was not just a political or economic struggle, but a battle for the very soul of nations and peoples around the world. The ideological divide between the United States and the Soviet Union shaped the global landscape for decades, influencing international relations, domestic policies, and even cultural expressions. The United States championed capitalism, a system based on private ownership, free markets, and individual liberty. This ideology was deeply rooted in the American dream, the belief that anyone, regardless of their background, could achieve success through hard work and determination. The post-World War II era saw a boom in American prosperity, with bustling markets, suburban expansion, and the rise of consumer culture. Wall Street became a symbol of economic power and opportunity, attracting investments from around the globe. The Soviet Union, in contrast, promoted communism, an ideology that advocated for a classless society, state control of the means of production, and the abolition of private property. Inspired by the works of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, the Soviet leadership envisioned a world where wealth and resources were distributed equally among all citizens. May Day parades showcased the might of the working class, while collective farms aimed to eliminate the disparities seen in capitalist societies. Statues of Marx and Lenin stood as reminders of the revolutionary spirit that drove the Soviet Union's policies. This ideological divide was not merely theoretical, it had profound practical implications. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 became a stark symbol of this division, physically and ideologically separating East and West Berlin. Military parades in both the United States and the Soviet Union displayed their respective strengths as each side sought to demonstrate its superiority. The divide affected not only Europe, but also had ripple effects across the globe, influencing conflicts and alliances in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The United States, seeking to contain the spread of communism, poured billions of dollars into rebuilding war-torn Western Europe through the Marshall Plan. This massive economic aid program aimed to stabilize European economies, prevent the rise of communist movements, and create a bulwark against Soviet influence. The success of the Marshall Plan not only revitalized Western Europe, but also solidified the United States' role as a global leader in the post-war era. The Soviets, meanwhile, established communist regimes in Eastern Europe, creating a bloc of satellite states under their control. These countries, including East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, were integrated into the Soviet sphere of influence, with their political and economic systems closely aligned with Moscow's directives. Soviet tanks and military presence ensured that any dissent or move towards independence was swiftly crushed, maintaining a tight grip on the region. The world was dividing into two camps, each with its own economic system, political ideology, and sphere of influence. The formation of military alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact further solidified this division. NATO, led by the United States, aimed to protect Western democracies from Soviet aggression, while the Warsaw Pact, under Soviet leadership, sought to defend and promote communist interests. These alliances were not just military pacts, but also ideological commitments, binding member nations to their respective causes. This ideological struggle played out on a global stage. The United Nations became a battleground for diplomatic confrontations, with both superpowers using the platform to advance their agendas. Conflicts in Korea and Vietnam were direct manifestations of this ideological clash, with the United States and its allies supporting anti-communist forces, while the Soviet Union and China backed communist movements. Protests and uprisings around the world often had Cold War undertones, as people aligned themselves with one of the two superpowers. Both superpowers sought to win over hearts and minds in newly independent nations emerging from colonialism. Africa and Asia became key battlegrounds for influence, as the United States and the Soviet Union vied for the allegiance of these new nations. Diplomatic missions, cultural exchanges, and economic aid were tools used to sway these countries. The Peace Corps, established by the United States, sent volunteers to assist in development projects, while the Soviet Union offered scholarships and technical training to young leaders from these regions. They provided economic aid, military assistance, and propaganda to support their respective sides. The United States supplied military advisors and equipment to allies fighting communist insurgencies, while the Soviet Union did the same for its allies. Propaganda campaigns were launched to promote the virtues of each ideology, with posters, films, and radio broadcasts reaching audiences worldwide. This battle for ideological supremacy extended into every aspect of life, from education and media to science and technology. The battle for ideological supremacy was a defining feature of the Cold War. Political rallies, espionage activities, and the ever-present threat of nuclear war kept the world on edge. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear conflict, highlighting the dangers of this ideological struggle. Yet, despite the tensions and conflicts, the Cold War also spurred advancements in technology, space exploration, and international diplomacy, leaving a lasting legacy on the modern world. The early years of the Cold War were marked by a series of crises that solidified the division between East and West. In 1946, Winston Churchill famously declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, separating the Soviet-dominated East from the West. The Berlin Blockade of 1948–49, in which the Soviets blocked access to West Berlin, further heightened tensions.
The United States and its allies responded to Soviet pressure by forming the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. This military alliance, based on the principle of collective defense, committed its members to protecting each other from attack. The Soviet Union countered with the Warsaw Pact in 1955, a military alliance of communist states in Eastern Europe.
These early confrontations underscored the deep mistrust and hostility that characterized the Cold War. The world was divided into two armed camps, each suspicious of the other's intentions and prepared to defend its interests by any means necessary. The stage was set for a prolonged period of tension and